is Doug if you're just new to my channel. Welcome to Fat City Vinyl. Today I am going to be looking at a reggae reissue label that existed for a relatively short period of time in the early 2000s, yet left behind a concise but high quality and highly regarded body of work. That label was called Auralux. Now Auralux was following in the tradition of other labels through the 1980s, in the 1990s and beyond, that had sought to increase international awareness of Jamaican music, putting out older music in new issues with better sound quality, better artwork, better liner notes than maybe you had seen when these titles were originally out, if you could even have found them or bought them at that time. By the time Auralux came into the game, there's a wider international appreciation and awareness of reggae music, and labels in particular like Blood and Fire and Pressure Sounds in the UK in the 1990s have proven that there is a market for these kind of higher quality reissues, that there's a growing fan base out there for vintage Jamaican music. At this time, I have done videos on Blood and Fire and Pressure Sounds in the past. This will be kind of another in an occasional series looking at these labels, catching the reggae marketplace as it's transitioning from its initial popularity in the 1960s, 1970s, early 1980s into a new generation, new international appreciation, more knowledge being put out there, more titles available for the first time in a long time. Auralux was one of them, and these labels weren't necessarily expecting to get rich, putting out vintage Jamaican music, but they did it for the love of the music, and this video is in part intended to give thanks to those many individuals promoting the reggae music and promoting knowledge of it, yet they would run up against challenges in rapidly changing way in which music was consumed, promoted, and also through technology, the many challenges they would face. Auralux is a great example of this. Now, Auralux was founded by David Hill, who had founded the house label Newphonic in the UK. He's also done work with Strut Records, Soul Jazz Records. Now, he had several silent partners in this label, but if you were buying the releases as they were coming out, as I was, the name you would be familiar with was David Katz, who sourced all the material, sorted out the licensing agreements, and wrote all the liner notes. David Katz is a longtime reggae DJ, scholar, historian. He is the author of Solid Foundation, History of Reggae. Here he is here with the great Prince Buster, David Katz. He is also the author of the definitive Lee Perry biography, People Funny Boy. I got to give thanks to David Katz for reaching out to me directly for some of the information I'm going to be sharing with you in this video. The very first Auralux release, and the Auralux, David Katz had come into contact with David Hill and the other partners of Auralux as through his research, writing articles for various magazines, various music publications, and those books. He had built up an extensive list of contacts with producers and artists in Jamaica, some of whom had vintage material that they were shopping for a label to release on, sometimes unreleased material. So he connected with the owners of Auralux and became the head of A&R. The very first release on Auralux, most of them would be released, with a couple of exceptions, would be released on vinyl and CD with a fairly simple catalog number, Lux, and then either CD or LP depending on the issue. 001 in this case, the very first release on the label, came out in, I believe, 2004. The label is formed. Whip Them King Tubby. This is a compilation of Linval Thompson productions, of various artists. You've got Horace Andy, Linval Thompson himself, Johnny Clark, and then crucially, it also includes hometown versions. These are exclusive mixes done by King Tubby. As Linval Thompson himself assured David Katz, they were mixed by King Tubby personally, exclusive mixes for his legendary Hometown Hi-Fi sound system, which was destroyed in the 1970s by the police. But King Tubby had as well as mixing dubs, he had a thriving business making exclusive mixes of songs that you could only hear on sound systems. And of course, he had mixes for his own sound system. So this includes hard-hitting dub versions mixed for his own sound system. Now, the first couple of Auralux titles had some kind of unusual CD designs, non-standard clamshell designs, and they open with a little stud here to open up the box. I was buying most of them on CD at this time. A few of these are quite hard to obtain on vinyl now. Following that release, there would be a 12-inch sampler with a few of the tracks culled from this Whip Them King Tubby release. Then would follow, for the third release on the label, a 10-inch vinyl release. I don't have either of those. That 10-inch vinyl would include a couple of tracks from the next full-length release on Auralux. One of the key pieces of the label is called Upsetters 14 Dub Blackboard Jungle. Album maybe more commonly known today as Blackboard Jungle Dub, one of the very first dub albums, full-length dub albums released in 1973 in an extremely limited, supposedly about 300 copies, one of which the English reggae collector, reggae historian Dave Henley visited Lee Perry's studio in the late 1970s and rescued an original pressing which his kids were using as a frisbee at that time, a few years after its release. But this was originally released by Lee Perry in the early 1970s in a true stereo mix with rhythm in one channel and other instruments in the other channel. It was originally 14 tracks. This has expanded it, restored the original title and expanded it with some other contemporaneous tracks, also restored the mix. It's maybe more familiar through the version that came out in the US on Clock Tower Records as Blackboard Jungle Dub, but this had a shorter track list, omitting 2 tracks, and also Clock Tower label there. This is a RAS distributed copy from a few years later. RAS Records in the US, Blackboard Jungle Dub, key early dub album, one of the very first ever released, but not long unavailable in its original format until Auralux label put it back out again in an expanded form. To get the vinyl copy on this, unfortunately, I should have been buying vinyl in those days. I've been kicking myself ever since. You're looking at well over $100 to get that Auralux reissue on vinyl these days. Next up came African Anthem for the 5th release on the album, again with this kind of unusual clamshell design. The Mikey Dread album, African Anthem Dubwise, again originally come out through Dave Henley's Cruise label in the late 1970s, was actually a re-recording attempting to simulate Mikey Dread's Dread at the Controls radio show in Jamaica, where he would mix dub live on the air, throw in funny jingles. This was recorded in the studio, mixed by Prince Jammy, apparently recorded at midnight in the studio, but basically in attempting to put on record what his show would have felt like for an international audience. That was the 5th release on the label. The 6th was another Linval Thompson production of various artists. Roots of Dancehall, Linval Thompson meets the Roots Radix. Hopefully you can see that without too much glare. Again, this kind of unusual clamshell design on the CDs. Roots of Dancehall, hard-hitting various artists comp from Linval Thompson's productions of the early 1980s, the early dancehall sound with the Roots Radix. Following that release, the 7th release would be a sampler, an Auralux Reggae Showcase. Next up would be a King Jammy release, King Jammy in Roots. Again, various artists compilation with the likes of Johnny Osborne, Lend Me the Chopper, Laxley Castell, Hugh Mundel's King of Israel, Michael Rose, Born Free, various artists, Barry Brown on there, King Jammy in Roots, catching the rootsier sound of King Jammy in the early 1980s before the digital dancehall revolution began. That would be the 8th release on the label. Going into 2005, we would have Sufferation, again, a various artists compilation of 90 The Observer productions, maybe one of the better ones of him out there. The title track by Tyrone Taylor builds up to a passionate roar as he sings of the sufferation of his people. Might be a bit of a shock if you only know him from his kind of pop reggae hit Cottage in Negril. Also, the little recorded The Jewels are on here, as well as bigger names like Dennis Brown, Gregory Isaacs. These various artists' compilations on Auralux tend to have some of the well-known tunes that are often compiled on similar releases, with more obscure ones as well, and thus are of kind of interest to more than the casual collector. The 10th release would be Sly and Robbie's Taxi Sound. Again, Sly and Robbie Productions. Again, the tunes you've always got to have on these kind of compilations. Baltimore by the Tamlins, Heart Made of Stone by the Viceroys, but you also get Iny Kamosi with his crucial World of Music, which was heavily sampled by Damian Marley years later for Welcome to Jamrock. Sly and Robbie's Taxi Sound. Next up would be the Heptones, rare and unreleased songs from their Night Food album for Harry J, which appeared internationally on the Mango label. Harry J productions of the Heptones, as well as the crucial Party Time LP for Lee Perry. Cover coming on that one. And again, on the Mango label, the classic Party Time album. This collects some alternative tracks and acts as kind of an auxiliary release to those two classic albums. Next up would be Jack Ruby Hi-Fi. Jack Ruby was the producer, maybe best known for Burning Spear's Marcus Garvey LP, but he also recorded many, he was basically a sound system owner who got into production around the time of that classic Burning Spear album. This represents an album, and this is the original right here, Jack Ruby Hi-Fi, various artists LP with Ken Booth, and lesser known artists like Earth's Last Messengers. This appeared on the Clappers label, the classic Clappers record logo. Clappers was a very militant, very anti-capitalist label formed in Brooklyn by a former Island Records staffer who had helped to break Black Uhuru internationally, released a fairly small but very militant, very uncompromising reggae and hip-hop, and I think some alternative or punk type rock in the US. The great classic Jack Ruby Hi-Fi. Next up would be Barrington Levy in dub. Now, some of these tracks had been released on the this contains tracks that have been released on the Jaw Guidance label, a very rare LP, I think with no title, originally in Jamaica. Alternatively, some of the tracks were mixed, completely different mixes for the Big Showdown dub LP, credited to Scientist, and these contain versions of some of the tracks from Barrington Levy's Bounty Hunter LP, also known as Shaolin Temple. Bounty Hunter, as it was released in the US on the Jaw Life label. Further release from Auralux would be Shaolin Temple itself by Barrington Levy. Kind of slightly different version of that Bounty Hunter LP, but Shaolin Temple was the version that appeared on Jaw Guidance label in the UK. This one also pricey to get on vinyl these days, as is the dub version. Next up would be Prince Jammy's dub. Prince Jammy versus Crucial Bunny dub contest. Contains one of Jammy's very personal favorite dubs on here. Jammy's A Shine. Another Scientist dub, a very crucial reissue here. It's since been reissued by VP Records, But Dub Landing contained 2 volumes of scientists' dubs that had been out of print since the early 1980s, I believe. Dub Landing 1 and Dub Landing 2, hard-hitting scientists' dubs. Next, we're getting into DC Dub Connection, which appeared in 2007. These are dubs sourced through Earl Morgan of that group, the Heptones. There he is here. Earl Morgan, sometimes called Earl Heptones. Various dubs he put out in the late 1970s. These were released in the US, I believe. Contains dubs from some Heptones tracks, as well as various other artists he was working with at the time, including Alton Ellis. DC Dub Connection. I believe this one only came out on CD. Dread at the Controls dub would be Gussie Clarke dubs from the 1970s. This is the 20th release on Auralux, Lux CD 020. Now the final release on Auralux would be another Scientist dub album. This is the only one I do have on vinyl. Scientist, World at War. Kind of a cool cover art there. And that is the Auralux reissue. Auralux 21. This is 2008. This came out. These are Scientist dubs to Jimmy Riley tracks, which had originally come out in the early 1980s. His self-produced Put the People First album. Classic cover photo there. Back cover photo. This is my copy on Shanachie, original. Jimmy Riley. I actually found this in a thrift store many years ago. Couldn't believe it. A few other reggae titles there at the same time. But Scientist dub album, that would be, unfortunately, be the final release from Auralux, 2008. They had changed distributors early on. They had had some troubles with their initial distributor, but to get out of their contract, they had to pay out, unfortunately, and had some further troubles internationally with other distributors, as Mr. Katz explained to me directly. They also had a problem in the 2000s, the rise of file sharing. First of all, the dropping sales of physical media in general, physical media regards to music, and also the rise of file sharing technology took a big bite out of their sales. Particularly, he was saying they had sites in Russia and Brazil where you could get the Auralux titles with the click of a button, cost them big time in sales. He was being frustrated, feeling frustrated at the time when they were still working on the label because they were losing all these sales. And as soon as they would shut one down, it would just appear somewhere else. All their work was being downloaded for free. Years later, he told me that he actually went to a DJ gig. He was invited to a DJ gig in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Actually ran into one of the major bootleggers. Actually was invited there by one of the major people behind this free downloading. He was explaining he wanted to strangle this guy at the time. They were working on the label, but when they actually met face to face and were able to see each other's point of view, it was kind of a generational divide. These people thought they were promoting the label, and thought that people would download it and then go and buy the physical releases, but it wasn't happening that way. But they were able to reason things out. These people did kind of feel that they were promoting the label in some way, but it did cost them sales, which ultimately, with the changing marketplace, did Auralux in. After that 21st release, Scientist World at War, that would be the last we would hear of Auralux records, but some of those titles are still very in demand. Prices north of $100 for some of the vinyl releases, and the CDs can still be found very affordably if you can find them. So that is my look at Auralux label. Again, want to thank David Katz for explaining some of the background, the history of what went on there. And thanks everybody for watching. There will be more label spotlights going forward. Cheers.